Let me invite you to go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 19, and we'll be looking there in just a moment. Amy and I will be leaving this week. We're going to be celebrating 20 years of marriage on Tuesday, which apparently you people already knew for several weeks now. And none of you men have taken the time to remind me that my anniversary is this Tuesday. Faithless friends are you all. But in spite of your failures, I have made plans, and we are going to be away this week. I appreciate so much all of you making the time to be with us yesterday. That was a wonderful surprise for us, and it was just a delight. We are going to be talking about marriage this morning. And it's not because it's our anniversary. When I plan out sermons, I don't plan when they're going to fall. I just plan what order they're going to fall in. So I say I'm going to preach this and this and this and this. And so when a sermon on marriage falls in your 20th anniversary, I really probably should just say I planned that, but I did not. But it has been a cause for reflection. And as I think about what God's Word has to say about the subject of marriage and contemplate that deeply, I think one cannot help but be overwhelmed at what I've gotten myself into, what I've taken on as a particular reflector of Christ, and what God calls me to in that role. And I hope to relay the importance and the depth of that as we think about marriage this morning and this evening in a couple of lessons. In Matthew chapter 19, which we looked at last time, we talked about the home and what God has to say about it. Jesus, in response to the question of the Pharisees about divorce, turns back to Genesis chapter 1, and he says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning, he says, made them male and female. And then down in verse 8, he uses that phrase again. He said, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, it has not been this way. That's where I want to turn our attention this morning, is to the beginnings, to foundational elements. Marriage is a topic about which there is no shortage of material. Every bookstore has shelves lined with books from every imaginable perspective on the topic of marriage. Marriage seminars, marriage retreats, lectures. You can pull up YouTube videos, all sorts of counseling available for marriage. And I think so much of it is right there on the surface, and very little of it goes and says, what did God make here? What did he create, and what did he intend here? And I think so much is addressing the end result of the failures, but not the root causes of the failures. Not where we've gotten so far off the rails culturally, and therefore among God's people as well, because, as is so often the case, we follow the culture wherever they go. We just try to stay a respectable distance behind. And that is not sufficient, especially as culture may get farther and farther from God's Word. I think on the issue of marriage, particularly, it's not that society has ever presented an accurate or perfect picture of marriage, but certainly there have been times in which what society thought about marriage overlapped a lot more with what the Bible said. And I think what we find now is an ever-shrinking sliver of overlapping between what the world says about marriage and what the Bible says about that. That means that we're going to have to be more insistent and have more clarity when we talk about what the Bible says about marriage. I want to begin with this thought, that when you marry, you begin to teach something. What Paul says in Matthew or Ephesians chapter 5 and beginning in verse 22, as my dad read a few moments ago, he points to Christ in the church and he says here, marriage is a shadow, it is a type of the reality of Christ in the church. And so the husband is like Christ and the wife is like the church. And when we marry, what we end up doing is we say either true things about that or we say false things about that. So an unfaithful husband is not only an adulterer, he's a blasphemer. Because he is saying this is what husbands are. And it's not true. The husband is faithful. And he is the very definition of faithfulness. And so we as husbands are to be the very definition of faithfulness. And you can't get out of that. You know, there are a lot of people who would enter into marriage and say, I have no intention of saying anything about Christ. You will whether you want to or not. You'll either be someone who preaches true things or preaches false things, but you'll be preaching. And so that's the nature of the tie that Paul makes for us here. But it is not just that we are saying something about Christ in the church, but we are also saying something about God's creation. And that goes back to Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus says, here, God created this institution, and he created the institution with roles for men and roles for women, for husbands to be something and for wives to be something. And what Paul says in Romans chapter 1 as he goes through and talks about the decline of the Gentile world is he says that one of the things that they did is began to deny the very nature of things, right? They denied creation. By denying the Creator, they began to deny the elements of creation. And so they engaged in what was not natural and denied it in those ways. One of the things that we see there in Matthew chapter 4 is that the created marriage in Genesis is meant to be prototypical. That is to say that what God did and what God said there was meant to communicate very specific things and to communicate them broadly about men and women, about marriage in general. So when he quotes from that, he says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? So Jesus is going to make a case about divorce on the basis that when God created Adam and Eve and when he brought them together as man and wife, that there are certain implications that apply to every marriage that ever exists. It's not, you couldn't say, oh, well, now that was Adam and Eve and that was their circumstances and that's the place that they lived and we don't live in that place and we're not Adam and Eve and so our circumstances are different. No, Jesus says they represent all of us and their marriage represents our marriages, especially in so much as God is involved in the creation. And so what he says particularly about that marriage applies to all of us. So we don't separate ourselves even all the way back from the beginning from Adam and Eve, and then therefore we don't separate ourselves from any of the other observations that God makes along the way about marriage, saying, well, there's just cultural separation. There's going to be cultural separation. There would certainly be it between us and Adam and Eve, because you'll never get a more different culture than two people versus what we live in now. But Jesus says, what God says there, it will always and ever apply. And so we can draw similar inferences. Jesus draws the inference that when God says we bring them, he brought them together and he joined them and they are one flesh, that they should not be sundered. God didn't have to say they should not be sundered. We can draw that implication. He says that he made them male and female. And so we can draw implications about homosexuality. We don't have to even go to specific condemnations of homosexual marriage, though. We could do that too. But this is enough. It is enough for God to say, I created a man and I created a woman. And that is the very nature of this relationship. We find too in the Genesis account that beginning in verse 18, God told him to look out among the animals, among the beasts of the field. And as Adam goes and he looks and he names the beasts of the field, he does not find a helpmate suitable to him. I dread the day where this needs to be said even more than it does, but it already needs to be said. That excludes bestiality. And in fact, it emphatically does so. God says, look, and you will not find what you're looking for there. And so when men go looking for something there, God has even already addressed that. It's not there. And we can draw those sorts of inferences. He created one man and one woman. And so from the beginning, we find that polygamy is out. It's not it's not part of what God made and intended and created. And just like divorce, all along we may find examples of people doing that. The very first is right there in Genesis chapter 4, Lamech, the descendant of Cain, engaging in polygamy, but that does not recommend it. And in fact, every presentation of polygamy disrecommends it, if that is a word. But from the very beginning, we could take the same premise. What do we see? What do we see in marriage, and what is the prototype? And there's one, and there's one, and there's one flesh. And how do you become one flesh with more than one person? So, could I say this about that? We already find ourselves having to make arguments against homosexual marriage. Are you ready to make arguments against polygamy? Because we will need to. You see, one transgression will lead to another. The arguments made for the one transgression will be made for the other. And I dare say I've talked with some brethren who are not ready for that argument yet because they do struggle with finding polygamous relationships in the Old Testament. But we have right here Jesus showing us the way. Go back to the beginning. What did God create? What did he say when he created marriage? And we can lean on that, and we can stand on that, and we can draw firm conclusions on that. And God does not have to spell out in every detail, every particular. He said enough. He said, I created this male and this female, and I have joined them, and they are one flesh, and everything else is out. Everything else is excluded. I think in terms of that, as we look at that creation story, and as we look at the story of marriage as it is being invented, we might say, that there are things being communicated there that we don't pay attention to anymore, and that there are elements in marriages that we think are merely traditional elements, but actually have foundations right there in the creation story of marriage. So, for instance, has been in vogue on occasion over the last 50 years probably, for women to begin rebelling against the notion of taking on her husband's name. Now, I don't hear a lot of that in the church, though I do hear it sometimes. But when I do hear an argument against that, there's an argument about keeping my own identity, or it's just a tradition. And I think sometimes that we don't evaluate, we don't think of moral implications of traditions or moral connections of traditions. But I think in the taking of a name, a very simple aspect of marriage, a woman taking her husband's name is right there from the very beginning. And there are implications that go along with it. So if you look back to Genesis chapter 2, you see that God has told God has told Adam to look at among the beasts, beginning in verse 18. He does not find a helper suitable. He named them all. And then he comes and he forms this woman from the rib of the man. And Adam says in verse 23, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Now, what woman is in Hebrew is like English. It is a word that comes from the root word man. So ish would be the root word man. And then isha, or something similar to that. I don't know how they would pronounce that. That's how I pronounce that. But you hear the similarity there, and so you add a couple of letters, and so what he says is, here is something that came from me, and he gave her the name there. Over in chapter 5, it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam in the day when God created man. He made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them man in the day when they were created. Now, what we find is it's a perfectly appropriate thing then to call Adam and Eve man, and to call all of us mankind, and that there is a headship relationship with that understanding. So Adam is the one who gives his name, who adds his name, or adds an element to his name, to name Eve. God comes in and he calls Adam and Eve by Adam's name and holds that over her as a descriptor. And then, of course, we have the elements all through the scriptures which show us that we find repeatedly when women are introduced into the story, they're introduced as the wife of. In instances where men are introduced in the same circumstances, and we don't know what their wife's name is. They're not introduced as the husband of. Deborah would be a particular example. As you're going through the book of Judges, we know that Deborah was the wife of Lapidoth. But I don't know who Othniel's, Ehud's, Shamgar's. It's not as important. Those are not identifiers of those men, but Deborah is identified by her husband. And that's an important element as you're reading through the book of Judges, that when this woman comes to judge Israel, there's other elements there as well that distinguish her from the rest of the judges. And so the identity goes that way. The umbrella identity goes that way. It does not go the other way. I do find it ironic that when women rebel against that, they rebel against that so as to keep generally their father's name. I don't know why they're not rebelling against that. Of course, if they rebelled against that, they're going to have to go take somebody else's father's name. And at some point, they're just going to have to submit to the notion that some man's name is going to be attached to them unless they just make something up, which I suppose some do. I think 1 Corinthians chapter 11 reflects this notion of the naming. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and verse 8 beginning, as Paul is making arguments about the covering and its role in their assembly. And beginning in verse 8, he uses arguments about headship. And there he says, for man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. That's important, he says. For indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. However, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originates from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. I think here we have a balancing element of the name concern. So Adam names Eve woman in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 20, it says that he named her Eve because she was the mother of all the living. And you have a reflection of that here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, that in the first instance it says she was created after him and for him and from him. But just to be clear, even though I'm making a case about headship here, don't take that so far as you forget the fact that all men come from women too. And so this is not to say that because woman takes on man's name that she disappears. That she is still a critical element and a noticed element and a praised and glorified element of the relationship. But it is, as they become one, it is his name that describes the one. that they become. And so what people think of as just, look, it's just something we do, it's something we've always done. Yeah, well, there's a reason. There's a reason we've always done that. And do we think in those terms, or do we think this is just part of the patriarchy or something like that? I think along those lines, and again, there in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, even the companionship that's described there in Genesis should reflect creation. We note, and I note frequently what God says here as he creates marriage in Genesis chapter 2, that it is not good for man to be alone, and he shows Adam that it's not good for him to be alone, that there's no helper suitable for him, and so he creates woman, a helpmeet for him. And while that's got a lot of sort of sentimental beauty, and even substantive beauty, there is an aspect of that relationship that is that needs to be recognized, and that is that this companionship does not work the same in both directions. Man does not need woman for the same reasons that woman needs man. They do need each other, but not in the same ways. And so you can't take the instructions and the descriptions that are given of each, and you can't make them interchangeable. It won't work. In Ephesians chapter 5, you can't just say, well, look, in a lot of ways, she ought to be like Christ. No, that's not what he says. Here is man, here is the husband. He is the Christ representative. Here is woman. She is the church representative. And you can't just go swapping those out and it just works the same. No, it does not. In fact, it's a disaster when you go trying to swap the pieces out and act like they are interchangeable. I think about that in terms of equality. We talk about equality. Obviously, Paul wants to remind us of an element of equality in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 when he talks about women being the mothers of all men, right? Men come from women. And so he wants us to not take the headship notion to lower women's value, I would think, is what he's cautioning against. But even though there is that difference in, or that sameness in value, it's not a mathematical equality. As I'm teaching my girls math, to their sorrow, we go through, and one of the principles, and they think this is so silly, but it's really important, to establish that if A equals B, then B equals A. And you think, well, why do you even need to state that? Well, you do. But nevertheless, that's what it means. You could swap them out, you can put them in any order, and if this equals this, then this equals this. They're interchangeable. That's not what equality means when we're talking about equality in God's eyes. That's not what equality means when Paul says there's neither male nor female. What he means is we are of equal value before God, but that doesn't mean we're interchangeable. We are very distinct. And you can't say one is the same as the other. One has the same function as the other. One writer put it this way upon observing what we find in Genesis chapter 2 and upon reflection of some other things that Paul has to say about that. He says, what man needs is help, and what woman needs is to help. She has a role, and her role is aimed towards him. His role is aimed towards responsibilities that he has. And God aims her at him and says, now you help him. And that causes a lot of conflict because where women are generally personally focused, so what she wants is her to be aimed back at her the same way she's aimed at him, and it's not so. And men are generally like this. We're side-by-side people, and we're focused like this. And so instead of having this, we want a companion that's more like us. And let me just say, it doesn't work out very good. when you have a companion that's just like you. You want a companion that fits in the way that God has created them to fit. So, it's not a companionship where we just, in a very surface way, in an interchangeable way, we just learn each other and we just learn the uniquenesses. All of that's important. But it's also learning, what is my role as a man and what is my role as a woman? And that has nothing to do necessarily with our own uniquenesses. That has to do with what God created. Well, one of the things he created was that headship, was that order. And that is so pressed upon in these passages we've been looking at, as well as some others. He firmly planted that in creation, but he also planted it in the scheme of salvation. And so as we look at Ephesians 5 and verses 22 through 33, and he says that the husband is Christ, that we need to reflect on the impact of that. When it says, like the church is subject to Christ, that she is to be subject in all things. I think we cannot, as a society cannot quickly enough pull the reins back on that and go, whoa, 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 whoa. I mean, he's not a Christ figure. No, he literally is a Christ figure. That's his job. That's his leadership and authoritative role. And her role is submissive and yielding and following. And as I say, it's there from the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 2, it's not just there from the standpoint of the order, which that's there too. God says it matters that Adam was created first. And it matters also that Eve was created for Adam and not the other way around, that there's very important implications there. But notice also the breakdown. So if you go through chapter 2, particularly beginning in verse 18, that God tells Abraham to look out, and he names the animals, and then Eve is brought along and he names woman. And we end up with a hierarchy that's pretty clearly communicated. You have God, you have man, you have woman, you have the beasts. Then we come to chapter 3. And what do we have? We have the beast who's instructing the woman, who's instructing her husband, who goes back and instructs God. And the entire thing is turned on its head. And so Genesis chapter 3 is not just a story of people doing what God did not say, but in fact turning everything upside down from the ground up. It's a reversal of the creation order. And in so many ways, we keep telling that story as opposed to the Genesis 2 story. And the Genesis 2 story is the one that we need to be trying to get back to, not the Genesis 3 one. And we are listening essentially to the dumb animals. And we are letting the world and nature or whatever tell us that we've got it all backwards. We've got it all wrong. The husband is head of the wife, as we see there in Ephesians 5 and verse 23. I think one of the things that's important is to note that it says he is the head of the wife, not he ought to be. This is not instructive. It's not saying, here's what you need to do, husbands. Now, we can take some instruction from that, but it's saying, here's what you are. When you become a husband, here's what that is. Here's the definition of that. You're head of the wife. When a husband does not lead, this is a failure of leadership. And it is a failure, it is his failure, because he is the head. One of the things that's been frustrating throughout the years is when I hear young people ask for advice about marriage, and I hear older Christians, men, say something that in essence is just make sure you give her her way. If you just remember this, say yes ma'am and everything will be fine. And people chuckle, ha ha ha. And what they just said is utterly abdicate your responsibility and it'll all go great. And it does not. It's a ruin. And men give over, they abdicate, or even they say, look, that's not how I lead. It's how Christ leads. It's how he leads, and therefore it's how you ought to lead. And so when we say a husband ought to lead, what we're really saying is he ought to act like what he is. What he represents. That is, he is the head of his wife. And when men don't exercise that role, they don't just influence through their leadership, they influence through their failure of leadership. I think God set men in place as the dominating aspect, and I don't mean that dominating in all the negative ways. I mean in the ways that God gave man dominion over the earth. He is the most dominant aspect of the home. And he is the most dominant aspect when he is there and doing what he ought to do and leading and influence, being the greatest influence on the home. And he is the most dominant aspect when he is completely absent. Because I don't know of anything that affects a home more than a father not being there. Now, do I mean that a home cannot be conducted without a father? No, it can. But it will be sorely lacking. And there's nothing that will lack more than that single element. And the world has recognized that. And the world has researched that. And the world will tell you in psychological terms, here's the consequences of no man in the home. And so, God put him there and he says, this is what he is. And he'll be that in a way that brings joy and gladness to the home, or he'll be that in failure in a way that brings misery and disaster to the home. Along those lines, I want to suggest to you, headship means total responsibility. Tom Holly was telling me about a book by a ship captain who took one of the least desirable positions in the Navy, one of the least desirable ships, and he took it over. And he made it into one of the most desirable ships. And his book is called, It's My Ship. And that recognizing that he had to take ownership for everything that happened there turned everything around. And that so long as the leadership was willing to say, it's not my fault, it's somebody else's job, this is not my responsibility, nothing was going to change. And let me just say, that's the way most military hierarchies run, right? So that if your subordinates do something wrong, yes, they are guilty of that, but who are they coming for? Who's the commanding officer? You're the one responsible. And in the home, it's the father's home. It's his. He is the head of it. And he is therefore responsible for whatever happens in it. Every sin in your home is yours to deal with. Whoever commits it, you have a responsibility to deal with that if you are the father. Because you own it. And you say, well, they've got some responsibility. They do. And you're the one that's there to tell them about that responsibility and guide them in that responsibility and lead by example in that responsibility. It's you. Amy and I were reading through a book talking about this sort of extreme personal responsibility of the father in the home. And she said, it sounds like, jokingly, she said, it sounds like this guy says all of my faults or all of my problems are your fault. So that's not what he said. He said, all of your faults are my problem. That's not the same thing. And of course, she was joking and she knew, but it helped me formulate that notion as that guy was communicating that. That doesn't mean that I become guilty of everything that my family does. It means I become responsible for everything my family does. That's Christ. See, he didn't become guilty of all of our sins, but he takes on the responsibility of our sins, doesn't he? And he says, I'll pay for them. And I'm the one that will lead you out of them. I'm the one that will help you put these things away. It's my job. In Numbers chapter 30, we see this reflected almost in a passing way in the law. Numbers chapter 30, and beginning in verse 13. Every vow and every binding oath to humble herself, this is speaking of a wife. Every vow and every binding oath to humble herself, her husband may confirm it or her husband may annul it. But if her husband indeed says nothing to her from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or all her obligations which are on her. He has confirmed them because he said nothing to her on the day that he heard them. But if indeed annuls them after he has heard them, then he shall bear her guilt. And so you take responsibility for whatever. He says her vows become your vows. And even her vows, if you annul them, become your responsibility even then. And I particularly like that element of if you just don't say anything. Let's say you just plead the fifth. I'm out of it. That's yours too. Even abdication makes it yours. It's your responsibility. You may not take it. You may not verbally say, yes, I will take this, but it's yours all the same. Isn't it? So, that's pretty extreme in its ownership. I'll tell you a way that practically works out. Have you ever been in a discussion with your wife or your children, and maybe they say, let's do it this way. And you go, whatever, I don't care. That's sort of that you say and nothing. That's pretty similar. So you say, I don't care. That's your response. And then you go through and you do it her way or the children's way. And maybe in that I don't care, you gave some indication, I don't think this will turn out well, but whatever. And then it doesn't turn out well. What do you do with that? Do you say, well, I told you it wouldn't turn out well? And you throw them under the bus. Because it was their decision, right? No, it was yours. It was yours. You were the one who consented. And if all you did is say, I don't want to have a part in this, you consented. Because you're the husband. Because you're the father. And it's yours. And so once you agree, once you sign on, then you don't put the burden on your wife anymore and say, oh, well, that was her idea. No, it's yours too now. And that's fine. That's fine to take her ideas or your children's ideas and to take that under advisement and do, but then it's yours. And so much of the problem is we want to maintain that independence when we've actually become one flesh. And I'm the one in charge of the one flesh. And so all the responsibility, primarily, first and foremost, falls on me. This means that you take ownership even of her weakness. Over in 1 Peter, chapter 3, is a passage that is well known and infamous in a number of Bible classes. 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, you husbands in the same way live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Now, I think a modern ear can hardly help but hear that in the most condescending way, since she is weaker, since she's a woman. And then I've been in Bible classes where people immediately scramble to figure out how to say weaker doesn't mean weaker. That it's just a weakness of position, that she's just weaker in that she doesn't have the same authority. And so he needs to appreciate that she's been put in that weaker relational position. But there's no actual weakness between men and women, which is absurd to any observer throughout all of history until the last, say, 100 years. Nobody balked at this. Everybody's like, well, obviously. And you might say, well, what obvious ways? Let me just tell you, if we have to have that conversation, we need to have a lot more conversations. If you don't understand the nature of strength and weakness here. Now, here's the problem. Weakness is not an evaluation, or rather a valuation statement. It is simply an observational statement. It's not saying that weakness and strength, that strength is better and weakness is worse. Which is stronger, a sledgehammer or a teacup? Which is better, a sledgehammer or a teacup? Well, the first question is pretty easy to answer. The second one depends on a lot of factors. If I need to hammer a nail, well, neither one may be particularly great, but I'll take the sledgehammer. But there's a lot of places where sledgehammers are disastrous, and we need the teacup. Or whatever else you want to throw into that illustration, the thing that in and of itself is more fragile, is more easily broken. And I do want to say this about that what that demands is a strength in the husband, willingness to stand up and take that ownership. How many times I've had this conversation, I've been guilty of saying this sort of thing. How many times have we had this conversation, husbands among ourselves, about how your children do what you say and they don't do what your wife says? You ever had that conversation? You know, look, when I tell them to, they get right to it because they know what's coming. I had that conversation with my wife. I don't know how many times. It's like, why do they do what you say? Because I hit harder. I mean, really. Because they're more afraid of the consequences if they don't do what I say. Look, that may sound insane to people of the world, but that is a pretty basic element. I remember the moment that it got past the point that my mother was physically capable of imposing that kind of fear. Not any kind of fear, but that kind of fear. She reared back and she swung, and to this day I wish I could pull it back, but I laughed. And then she said what a woman ought to be able to say: you wait till I tell your father. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, when I walk in and my wife says they are not minding me like they mind you, instead of saying you should do something different, I ought to step up and say to my children that is my problem. That her weakness is mine to own. And when you dare disrespect your mother, that is me you are disrespecting. She's mine. And her weakness is mine. And my strength should be hers. And so this competition where men are like, yeah, they do it. Well, of course they do. And if they don't do what your wife's saying, that's your fault. What are you doing about it? You're the head. How dare you let a subordinate not follow what a superior officer is telling them what to do? And you take charge of that situation. Of course, in that you value that weakness. You understand it. You make good usage. You understand how it plays into the relationship. Ultimately, in this headship, in this ownership, what we're working towards is the as Joshua seems to have in Joshua 24, is the ability to speak for our houses. Do we have that kind of influence, that kind of headship? Can we walk around and say, my house is this, with any confidence? In Joshua 24, and in verse 15, well-known statement, if it is disagreeable in your sight to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which are beyond the river, are the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I don't think he's just blowing smoke there. I think Joshua knows what he and his house will do. I've heard a number of preachers say things like, don't ever preach about family while your family's actually in the audience. I have always bristled at that. Don't preach about raising children when you got children right there. I hate that notion. I hate the notion that basically I can't really have any certainty over my house and their response to my leadership. If I can't say with any certainty what my house is going to do on this or that, now you may say, what if it's on some particular? If we're talking about specifics, I may go ask them. We're talking about moral choices. I ought to be able to be leading in a way and know my family and have a relationship with my family where I can say, yes, this is what we will do. And have some confidence in it. But you can't do that if you sort of go through letting people do their own thing. And going through marriage, sort of letting nature take its course. I'll talk a little bit more about that notion this evening. I think that's what most people do. They don't look at marriage as something that God has given them all those responsibilities. They look at it as an hopefully amiable relationship that we enter into. Not the sort of undertaking that God says you are about to pick up a load like Christ picking up the church. Are you ready for that? Because if you're not, then you're not ready for marriage. If you're ready to take that kind of responsibility, then all right. Now, all of this by implication means that the wife should be there supporting this kind of leadership and headship. We'll talk more about that this evening, about the roles, more specific roles of husbands and wives and how those things fit together. Too often, we talk about that headship of Christ merely in terms of Christ's gentleness, merely in terms of Christ's kindness, and that needs to be talked about. We talk about that so much because we're afraid of the abuses of a husband who comes and is a brute. But we talk about it in such a way as if almost we're ignoring the dangers on the other side of him being an abdicator, being someone who does not lead. I thank God that we do have Christ as that perfect example. And I thank him for the reality that Christ does stand up and take responsibility for what happens in his house. And he does guide us and direct us. And he doesn't say, I don't know, what do you think? He says, here's the path to get to heaven. You follow me. Now, if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, he is that perfect husband. And he is the perfect husband who not only would be a good husband to you, but would make you a good spouse. Make you into the perfect bride. And it will be the most beautiful, whatever perversions and lies you may have been preached by looking at marriages that are around you. This is finally the only perfect sermon that will be preached on that. And so if you need to respond to that invitation, to that proposal, well, we'd invite you to do that this morning. If there's any way that we can help you enter into that relationship with Christ, won't you come while we stand?